When I look back upon the days of my youth, the year 1432 seems both a distant dream and as close as the breath on a winter windowpane. My name is Eleanor, and this is my story woven into the cobblestone streets and wild forests surrounding New Boston, a city that thrives on the edge of the known world. Ours was a land of promise and peril, with thick forests and rolling hills, but also the ever-present tension of kingdoms and the shadow of kings. I was just 20 then, though already the years had taught me as much about joy as they had about hardship. My father had passed on when I was still a girl, leaving my mother and me to fend for ourselves. We lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of New Boston, not far from the river that brought goods and stories from distant places. Our house was simple, built of timber, with a stone hearth that warmed the rooms on cold nights and small windows that let in the scent of pine and earth. Some might have called it poor, but to me it was a place of comfort and love. After my father's death, Thomas entered our lives, a carpenter by trade and a gentle soul. He had come to repair the roof one autumn when the rains threatened to wash away the last of our savings and stayed long after his work was done. It was Thomas who taught me to see beauty in the ordinary, the golden glow of sunlight on worn wooden beams, the music of laughter echoing off the kitchen walls, the shared peace of a meal earned by honest hands. He was a tall man with dark hair and warm brown eyes that seemed always to be smiling, even when his pockets were empty. With Thomas, I found a happiness that no palace could have given me. Our wealth was not measured in dollars or pounds, though what little we had came from his work. And the silver coins clinked softly in a jar above the mantel, but in the quiet certainty of belonging. Those were the days when I felt most alive, rising with the sun to fetch water from the well, tending to the small garden behind our cottage, and walking the path into the city to sell the herbs and flowers I grew. New Boston was a city of contradictions, grand and rough-edged, filled with traders from the west and fishermen from the great northern lakes. Its streets were noisy with the voices of merchants and the creak of wagon wheels. But looming over it all, like a silent judge, stood the palace of King Henry of the Eastern Territories. King Henry was a figure shrouded in both reverence and fear. They said he was born in England, of royal blood, and crossed the ocean to rule these wild lands in the name of his ancestors. His palace was a fortress of white stone, perched atop a hill, with soaring towers and gardens said to be filled with roses that bloomed all year. The city owed its prosperity to the king's protection, yet his taxes weighed heavy on every home. Few saw the king up close. He kept to his circle, surrounded by lords and ladies, and his soldiers patrolled the streets with grim faces. Rumors swirled about his temper and his pride, and how he loved only gold, power, and beautiful things. I had heard all the stories, but the king was no more real to me than the old legends. That is, until the day fate crossed our paths. It was a bright morning in May, the air filled with the scent of lilacs and the promise of summer. I had walked into the city with a basket of wildflowers, hoping to trade them for fresh bread and a spool of thread. The streets were especially busy that day, as a royal procession was said to be making its way from the palace to the cathedral. I paid little attention at first. Such displays were for the nobles, not for the likes of me. As I turned a corner near the old market square, a sudden hush fell over the crowd. People pressed against the buildings, heads bowed, as a line of armored soldiers advanced, clearing a path. And then, in a carriage drawn by 4 gleaming horses, sat the king himself. His face was partly hidden by the velvet curtains, but I saw him clearly as the carriage slowed to pass the market. I remember my heart leaping into my throat. It wasn't fear exactly, but a strange, breathless awareness. The king's eyes met mine, cold, pale gray, sharp as winter frost. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The bustle of the city faded, the shouts and clatter falling away. He looked at me, not as one might glance at a stranger, but as a hunter marks his prey. My cheeks burned. I quickly lowered my gaze, but I could feel the weight of his attention, as real as a hand on my shoulder. The king's carriage rolled on, but the memory of his stare lingered, unsettling the peace I had always known. I hurried home, heart pounding, certain that nothing more would come of it. After all, I was only a carpenter's wife, with no fortune and no title. The king had his world, and I had mine. Yet deep inside, I sensed that a change had been set in motion, a ripple that would soon become a storm. That evening, as Thomas and I shared a humble supper of stew and bread, I tried to put the encounter from my mind. But when the wind rattled the window panes and the shadows crept longer across the walls, I felt unease settle over me like a heavy cloak. I clung to Thomas, to the safety of our little home, unaware that the king's gaze would soon append everything I had ever known. The first thread of my fate had been pulled, and in the silent darkness, this story had truly begun. The days that followed the king's gaze upon me were heavy with an unease that I could not name. A shadow that crept across my mind, no matter how I tried to brush it away. I busied myself with my chores, gathering eggs in the morning mist, kneading dough with floury hands and humming softly to mask my nervousness. But beneath my outward calm, my heart thudded anxiously. At night I found myself lying awake beside Thomas, listening to the wind in the rafters and wondering if the king's eyes had truly seen me, or if it had all been a fleeting moment, easily forgotten by a man with a crown and a kingdom. It was a Tuesday afternoon, as the bells of St. Anne's tolled the hour when fate returned to my door, this time bearing the king's own seal. I was kneeling by the hearth, scrubbing at a stubborn stain, when a sharp knock startled me upright. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the door to a sight I had only ever glimpsed from afar, a royal messenger clad in deep green livery, his boots polished to a shine, the golden crest of King Henry gleaming on his breast. His horse, a sleek black stallion, stood quietly by the gate, as if well trained in royal errands. Without so much as a word of greeting, the messenger held out a scroll of parchment. The wax was stamped with the unmistakable lion of the Eastern Territories. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands trembled as I took the letter. The messenger tipped his hat and turned away, leaving me alone on the threshold, staring at the message that would unravel my world. I closed the door and leaned against it, my chest tight. Thomas was not home. He had gone to the far side of New Boston to repair a roof that threatened to cave in. I broke the seal and unrolled the parchment. The words danced before my eyes, each one written in a practiced, elegant hand. To Eleanor of New Boston, the beauty of your face and the grace of your bearing has reached my court and captured my heart. Come live with me in my palace. I shall honor you above all others and surround you with riches beyond your dreams, gold dollars, silver pounds and silks from across the sea. You shall live as a queen at my side, beloved and envied, and I will see to it that all your needs and desires are met. Present yourself at my gates within 3 days, or I shall send for you myself. King Henry of the Eastern Territories. I read the letter again and again, each time more stunned. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. The promise of wealth, the threat disguised as an invitation, the presumption that my life could be bought like a trinket in the market. My hands shook with anger and fear. When Thomas returned that night, I showed him the letter.
He read it in silence, his jaw set, eyes clouded with worry. "We must refuse," he said at last.
No gold in the world can buy our happiness. You are my heart, Eleanor. I will not lose you, not even to a king. So I wrote a letter in reply. My words were plain and honest, for I had no skill with flattery or politics. Your Majesty, I am humbled by your notice, but my heart belongs to my husband. I am honored by your offer, but I must decline. Eleanor Thomas himself delivered it to the palace gates the next morning, and when he returned, we held each other and tried to believe it would be enough. For a time, it seemed as if nothing more would come of it. But a sense of foreboding lingered, as persistent as the fog that crept from the river at dusk. 3 days passed in uneasy peace. On the 4th night, the world changed forever. A storm howled outside, rain battering the windows and lightning splitting the sky. Thomas was gone, called away to help a neighbor who had fallen ill. I sat by the fire with my mother, trying to keep my mind from dark thoughts, when the sound of footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. Before I could rise, the door burst open and 4 men rushed in, faces hidden behind black masks, their voices low and urgent. "Eleanor," one of them said, "come with us. Do not struggle, or your family will suffer." My mother screamed, but they silenced her with a warning look. I tried to fight, but they were strong and swift. A cloth was pressed over my mouth, and darkness fell over me like a shroud. When I awoke, I was cold and confused. I could smell the tongue of wax and stone. My wrists were bound, but gently, as if my captors feared to leave a mark. The blindfold was pulled away, and I found myself standing in a vast, gilded hall. Candles flickered in silver sconces. The walls gleamed with tapestries and paintings of ancient battles. On a dais at the far end of the room sat King Henry himself, draped in velvet and gold, his crown glittering in the dim light. He regarded me with an expression that was equal parts admiration and calculation. "You refused my offer, Eleanor," he said, his voice cold as a blade. "Did you think a king would accept such a slight?" I stood as tall as I could, trying to keep my fear from showing. "I have done nothing wrong, Your Majesty. I wish only to live my life in peace with my husband." The king's lips curled in a faint, bitter smile. "You are brave, but your bravery will not protect your loved ones. Here is my new offer. Stay with me in this palace, or your family, your mother, your husband will suffer the consequences. Their lives are in your hands." My blood ran cold. I thought of Thomas, of my mother's gentle smile, of the cottage that was my world. At that moment, my pride meant nothing. All that mattered was their safety. With trembling hands, I bowed my head and whispered, "I will stay." The king smiled as if he had won a great prize. I was led away, deeper into the palace, to chambers filled with gold and luxury, a gilded cage for a captive bird. I spent that first night staring at the ornate ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar silence, longing for the comfort of my own home. The wealth around me was cold and empty. My heart ached with sorrow and guilt. And so, with the stroke of a king's pen and the violence of his will, I became a prisoner behind walls of gold, haunted by the memories of the life I'd left behind. In the depths of my captivity, days bled into one another, each marked only by the hollow echo of footsteps in the palace corridors and the chill of loneliness that crept through even the grandest rooms. I lived in a gilded prison, my every need met by silent servants and watchful guards, but my heart was never free. The memories of my cottage in New Boston, of Thomas's gentle touch and my mother's laughter, kept me company through endless, sleepless nights. I wondered every day if they were safe, if the king's men kept their word, or if some disaster had already befallen them while I wandered lost in the labyrinth of King Henry's palace. I learned to observe the patterns of the household, the coming and going of guards, the whispers of kitchen maids, the flickering lamplight in the long, cold halls. King Henry himself grew restless in those weeks. There was a tension in the air, as if the palace itself sensed the coming of a storm. Rumors reached my ears of unrest beyond the city walls. Travelers who passed through the palace gate spoke of armies gathering in the forests to the north and ships crowding the harbor, their sails marked with unfamiliar colors. The king grew harsher by the day, his temper fraying as reports trickled in from distant outposts, of villages set ablaze, of gold shipments intercepted, of merchants robbed on lonely roads. His fortune, though vast, seemed suddenly fragile, threatened by unseen hands. It was on a moonless night that the storm finally broke. I remember the darkness pressing close against the windows, the air so heavy it seemed to smother every breath. I lay awake, unable to sleep, haunted by the longing for freedom and the faces of those I loved. My chamber was high in the eastern tower, far from the main halls, yet I heard it, the first distant shouts, carried on the wind like the call of wild animals. At first, I thought it was only a dream, but then the sound grew a clash of steel, a chorus of angry voices, the unmistakable roar of battle. I sprang from my bed, heart pounding. From my window, I could see flames blooming in the city below, and tiny figures rushing through the streets, swords flashing in the torchlight. The enemy had come at last. It was Lord William of Brighton. His name had become a curse in the palace, whispered in fear by servants and soldiers alike. He was an exiled lord from England, banished for treason, but his cunning was matched only by his ambition. With an army gathered from the fringes of the kingdom and gold stolen from King Henry's coffers, he had returned to claim what he believed was his by right. The palace erupted in chaos. The guards who once watched me so closely now ran about in confusion, gathering weapons and shouting orders. The king himself was roused from his private chambers, his face pale with fury and fear. I saw him storm through the halls, his heavy robes trailing behind him, barking commands as he prepared to defend his fortress and his fortune. For the first time since my capture, the iron grip of the king's control faltered. In the confusion, I slipped from my room, moving quietly through the maze of hallways. I knew the way now. I had mapped in my mind over endless days of longing. The thick stone walls shuddered as catapults pounded the city gates, and the air was heavy with the scent of smoke and terror. I darted past servants fleeing for their lives and soldiers clutching swords with trembling hands. The shouts of battle grew louder as I reached the heart of the palace. It was then, in a moment of chance or fate, that I saw the door to the king's private study hanging open. The room beyond was normally forbidden, guarded day and night. Now, it stood unguarded, the king having rushed out in his panic. My breath caught as I stepped inside. The study was a cavern of opulence, polished oak shelves sagging with books, velvet drapes pulled tight against the night, and in the far corner, the great iron safe that was said to hold the wealth of the kingdom. Tonight the safe gaped open. Piles of gold dollars and stacks of pounds sterling gleamed in the candlelight, heaped atop one another as if the king had planned to move them quickly in the event of disaster. There were silver goblets, jeweled rings, and ropes of pearls, but it was the gold that drew my eye. I knew in that instant what I must do. If I could escape with this fortune, perhaps I could buy freedom, not just for myself, but for my family and all those whom the king had threatened. I grabbed a velvet sack from the king's desk and filled it with as much gold and as many pounds as I could carry, my hands shaking with fear and exhilaration. The coins were heavy, their promise bright and terrifying. With the sack slung across my shoulder, I crept from the study, careful not to make a sound. The battle was spilling into the palace itself now. Soldiers clashed in the great hall, and the cries of the wounded echoed off marble walls. Guided by half-remembered tales of secret passageways told to me by a kind kitchen maid, I found the narrow door that led from the main corridors down into the dark, winding tunnels beneath the palace. The passage was cold and cramped, lined with ancient stones and cobwebs, but it led to a hidden gate in the palace gardens. I emerged into the night, the sack of gold digging into my shoulder, and ran as fast as I could. In the chaos outside, I searched desperately for my family. I found my mother huddled with other servants near the stables, her eyes wide with terror. With barely a word, I pulled her close and led her away from the burning city. By some miracle, Thomas had managed to slip into the palace grounds in the confusion, his love for me stronger than any fear of the king's wrath. We embraced, tears mingling with the soot on our faces, and together we fled into the forest that ringed the city. Behind us, the palace burned, its towers outlined in fire against the black sky. The cries of battle faded as we ran deeper into the wilderness, gold weighing down our steps, but hoping to lift our hearts. We did not look back. The riches of a fallen kingdom clinked softly at my side, the promise of a new life lighting the darkness ahead. At that moment, we were no longer prisoners nor fugitives, but simply a family bound together by courage, love, and the fortune that fate had thrust into our hands. The night swallowed us whole, and the world of kings and crowns slipped away behind us, forever changed. We ran until our legs ached and our lungs burned, the wild forest swallowing us with each frantic step away from the burning city and the crumbling palace. I can still remember how the branches clawed at my dress and the weight of the gold pulled hard on my shoulder, but I clutched it tighter, unwilling to leave behind a single coin of the fortune that would save us. Thomas led the way, his steady hand guiding my mother and me through thickets and hidden trails he knew from his days as a boy. The darkness was thick as velvet, and only the distant glow of the palace fire told us where we'd come from, and warned us not to look back. For 3 days, we traveled in secret. We moved only at night, resting in hollows beneath ancient oaks, or in abandoned barns when the exhaustion became too great. By day, we hid in the brush and listened for the sounds of pursuit. More than once, I thought I heard the hooves of the king's men or the harsh voices of soldiers, but they never found us. Perhaps the chaos of Lord William's attack had covered our escape, or perhaps fate itself had turned its gaze away from King Henry's wrath. At last, when it seemed we could go no farther, we crossed the border into the western lands distant enough from New Boston that its name was little more than a legend whispered by traders. This was York, a region of gentle hills and fertile fields, where strangers might find a welcome so long as they brought coin and kept their secrets. Here the law was kept by local lords who owed no allegiance to King Henry, and word of the palace's fall was only a rumor, not a warning. Our first days in York were spent in hiding, but necessity soon forced us out. With the gold and pounds I had taken, we were able to purchase a small cottage on the edge of a sleepy village. Thomas found work easily. His skill as a carpenter was unmatched, and our neighbors welcomed us for the strength of his arms and the honesty of his smile. I kept to myself at first, fearful that someone might recognize my face or suspect the truth. My mother grew a small garden behind the house, and we shared our meals by candlelight, grateful for each day of peace. But gold is a seed that grows quickly, if tended with care. Within a year, we traded our cottage for a grand house, a true mansion with tall white columns, wide fields of wheat and barley, and a winding driveway lined with ancient oaks. The property had belonged to a nobleman who had fallen on hard times, and he was glad to sell it to a young family with more gold than questions. Our new home stood atop a hill overlooking the river, with a veranda that caught the morning sun and rooms so spacious that laughter echoed through the halls. For the first time in my life, I slept beneath a roof that neither leaked nor creaked with the wind, and I awoke each day to the soft sound of birds and the scent of blooming lilacs. We lived not as royalty, but as something better, as people who had earned their peace. Thomas and I gave generously to the village church and families in need, always careful to act with humility and kindness. Our wealth allowed us to hire help from the village honest men and women whose loyalty we earned not with gold alone, but with fair treatment and respect. My mother grew old in comfort, her years made sweet by the laughter of grandchildren and the warmth of the hearth. With time, I learned to set aside my fear. The story of the king's fall and the looting of his treasure became the stuff of distant rumor, shaped and reshaped by 1,000 mouths. No one ever suspected that the gentlewoman of York, the one who paid in gold dollars and silver pounds, who wore fine dresses but spoke humbly, had once been the captive of a king and the architect of his ruin. Even Thomas, who knew all my secrets, rarely spoke of the past. We both preferred the peace of our new life and the quiet joy of each other's company. Yet there were moments when the old anxieties would rise, unbidden. On quiet nights, when the house was still and the wind rustled the tall grass in the fields, I would sit alone on the veranda and think of the life we had left behind. I remembered the fear, the uncertainty, the sacrifice. I remembered the gold, the way it glittered in the firelight, the way it felt both heavy and necessary in my arms. I knew that our freedom had come at a price, and I never allowed myself to forget it. To those who asked, I simply said that Thomas and I had been lucky in trade, and that our fortune was the fruit of hard work and God's favor. In time, our children were born, first a daughter, whom we named Grace, and then a son, William. They grew up in sunshine and laughter, their days untroubled by kings or wars. They played in the fields, raced along the riverbanks, and listened wide-eyed to tales of brave knights and clever heroines. I never told them the full truth of how we came to be so comfortable, but I did teach them that freedom, once won, is the greatest treasure of all, and that courage and wit are worth more than all the gold in the world. Years passed, and I watched my children become strong and kind. Grace learned to read and write, her imagination soaring beyond the hills of York, while William worked beside his father in the carpentry shop, his laughter ringing out as he learned the trade. Our home became a gathering place for the village, filled with music and friendship, and I was often asked to give advice or lend a hand to neighbors in need. With each passing year, the scars of my captivity faded, replaced by gratitude and hope. As I sit now, pen in hand, watching the sunset over the fields that are ours, I know that the story of the stolen gold and the ruined king belongs to another world. My life, my true treasure, is here in the laughter of my children, the strength of Thomas's embrace, and the simple peace of freedom hard won. I have learned that the shadows of the past cannot dim the light of a new beginning, and that the courage of a single woman can indeed outshine all the gold in a kingdom. And so I tell you this tale not for glory nor wealth, but as a reminder to any who may listen, even in the darkest of times, it is possible to shape a new life from the ashes, to find hope in despair, and to choose love and freedom above all else. That, in the end, is the greatest adventure of all.